What is generative learning? Generative learning is actively making sense of information to apply to new situations. You can do this by mentally reorganizing, integrating the new information with what you already know. The idea of doing this is transforming information into usable knowledge. Most times, teachers focus on how they present the information, but we also need to focus on how learners make sense of the information we're presenting. This leads into generative learning theory. This theory states learning as an act of construction to new schemas and cognitive development. So information processing models, and it's emphasizing comprehension over memorization. So this is a way of building meaningful knowledge. It's this act of understanding versus regurgitating. And the easiest way to do that is to generate perceptions that are consistent with our prior knowledge, so that there's already a meaning-making path. So when we're thinking about generative learning, there are several models to consider. There's a 1989 model of generative learning that involves the contents of generation, motivation, attention, and memory. This model focuses on the science of learning and instruction. Then there's the multimedia SOI model, which is selecting, organizing, and integrating. This relies on the student's own cognitive process to be able to utilize materials. And then there's the ICAP model, which is interactive, constructive, active, and passive. This one is a little more complex if you don't know the terminology already. Passive is information without engagement in learning behavior, so lecturing. Active is engaging in some sort of overt action, like simple note-taking. And then constructive is engaging in behavior involving generating ideas beyond the needed information. And then interactive is engaging in a dialogue that involves that same constructive behavior. Students are going to get more out of your constructive and interactive lessons than they would out of a passive or active. So teachers need to know which one they're engaging. There are 8 learning strategies that we're going to focus on today that foster meaningful learning using the generative learning ideology. The first is summarizing. Summarizing is concisely stating the main ideas into one's own words. When you do this, you're selecting the important material and you're outlining and integrating this material within your students. It's important to note that when one is summarizing, there's going to be a lot of prior knowledge integrating into that summary. This is a really great idea for reading comprehension in language arts classrooms. Summarizing is better than just note-taking because it utilizes these prior bullets above. But it's also important to note that summarizing isn't always the best strategy. It's really only good for short texts or for less dense subjects. So having students read 5 pages isn't going to produce a good summary, but maybe a 1-page and summarizing into a few sentences or bullet points will be effective. Summarizing relies on a student's ability to generate quality summaries on their own, so it may require extensive training or the instructor modeling and giving feedback on their summaries. The second is mapping. Learners convert printed or spoken text into a spatial arrangement of words and links among them. This includes concept maps, knowledge maps, or graphic organizers. This encourages selection of relevant information and integrate material by linking it to each other. But much like summarizing, students need to be able to have the know-how of how to create such maps. This technique is going to have the strongest effect for students with low academic records. Sometimes creating the map can be very time-consuming, and if the map is too complex, students will lose interest. So it's important to figure out how to scaffold your mapping activity. The third is drawing. Creating a drawing to depict the content of a lesson. Taking a text into a pictorial representation requires students to select relevant information, show organization, and use prior knowledge to clarify meaning within the picture. However, when they're creating this drawing, there can be a lot of focus on the mechanics of drawing, and it can overcome the lesson's intentions. So it's important to minimize the mechanics of drawing so that you can also minimize the extraneous cognitive load. This can be also done with scaffolding by providing pre-drawn backgrounds or already designed shapes and fillers. Technology is a great asset in this skill. In order to prepare students for this method, this strategy of cognitive development, you may want to supply drawings and pictures within the text that they're reading. The fourth is imagining. Imagining is making mental images that depict the content of the lesson. The benefit of imagining over drawing is that there's no mechanical stress on the student. Imagining is great for procedural steps and structure and process based on readings. When you're translating text or oral verbiage into mental images, students are required to select relevant information, show organization, and use prior knowledge to clarify meaning within their mental images. The learners, much like in drawing, may be confused on what to imagine, so pre-training and specific instructions is highly recommended. This generative learning method is effective for students with higher rather than lower prior knowledge. Their higher prior knowledge is needed for making those mental images. Imagining may be beneficial for material that is not overly complex. Number 5 is self-testing. Self-testing is answering practice questions about previously learned material. When students do this, they're activating and retrieving the most relevant knowledge and organizing the material and strengthening existing connections between previously learned information. They're also having to integrate this material by building new connections between relevant info and previously learned info. And they're also exercising their neural pathways for information retrieval. This type of generative learning strategy has the most persistent learning outcomes and is known as the memory research testing effect. Students using the strategy have the long-term retention of learning materials. But it's important to note that self-testing is most effective when it's followed by corrective feedback, repeated trials, and when the self-testing format is similar to the actual testing format. Unlike imagining, self-testing can be used with complex learning materials. There's no training needed, and students need to be taught the value of testing over rereading. Number 6 is self-explaining. Self-explaining is explaining the content of the lesson to oneself during the learning. So restating important information, reviewing past ideas, generating inferences to organize mental models, and integrating prior knowledge by looking for consistencies and inconsistencies. Giving students time to talk to themselves and look back over the most recent notes may be beneficial throughout the course of the lesson. Students given that opportunity to have a running oral account for his or her efforts and understanding the materials allows them to clarify points and inferences. This specific material is great with scientific texts because they are complex. Often, students do not do self-explaining spontaneously, so it's important to prompt this within your students. Number 7 is teaching. Teaching is explaining to-be-learned material by helping others learn. When students are tasked with teaching the rest of the class about a specific content, they need to select relevant material for explanation, organize material in a coherent structure to be understood by others, and elaborate on their material by incorporating one's own existing knowledge, such as examples for theories that they are presenting to the class. Teaching as a learning strategy is already being used in classrooms with things such as peer tutoring, cooperative learning, and small group discussion. The act of explaining, preparing to teach, and interacting with others all builds to the value of teaching. Just like self-explanation, teaching also has shown positive results for delayed comprehension testing. However, the quality of explanation is imperative. So it's important to reflect on knowledge building during the process and elaborate on material using one's own personal knowledge. And the eighth and final strategy we're talking about today is enacting. This is engaging in task-relevant movements during the lesson. Science already does this well with things such as labs. But there's other ways you can do enacting. Enacting is manipulating objects and performing gestures in coordination with lesson content. When students do this, they're selecting relevant movements to perform, organizing material around movements selected, and integrating new representation within existing knowledge. Cognitive processes are deeply grounded in one's physical interaction with the external world. Students are given the opportunity to connect abstract concepts to concrete objects and actions in order to make connections between words and meaning of objects. This is really effective for higher skilled learners. But just like with self-testing and teaching, it requires a lot of feedback to use the manipulatives effectively. So some final thoughts. Generative learning is a reiterative and generative process. There is verbal and spatial generative learning strategies. Verbal strategies should not be using complex material, but require higher prior knowledge. Verbal strategies include summarizing, mapping, drawing, and imaging. There's also spatial strategies, which can use highly complex material and have a lower prior knowledge requirement. This includes self-testing, self-explaining, teaching, and enacting. Overall, generative learning theory views learning as a sense-making activity which involves building cognitive structures that can be used in new situations. It's this idea of a transfer goal in the learning process. How are students going to use this knowledge elsewhere in their life? It also focuses on assessing meaningful learning outcomes and long-term learning and recall. There's two routes to improving student learning. One is through improvements in the instruction, and this includes instructional methods. Teachers have already done a really good job focusing on this, but the second and less noteworthy is through improvements in the learner, and this involves the learning strategies we've just stated. By improving the learner, you're going to improve classroom motivation and metacognition. I hope I've been able to explain generative learning theory and how it benefits teachers and students through the 8 strategies mentioned.